The fluorescent lights of the Millbrook Waffle House cut through the misty Georgia night like a lighthouse guiding weary travelers home. At 2:47 a.m., the Crowman Vinyl Diner was mostly empty, save for the gentle clink of coffee cups and the low hum of the aging ventilation system. Jake Miller's weathered hands wrapped around his third cup of coffee as he tried to shake off the numbness of 14 hours behind the wheel. 27 years of long-haul trucking had taught him to read people like road signs, and something about tonight's energy felt off. Sarah, the overnight waitress who'd been serving him hash browns and coffee for the better part of a decade, moved with an unusual tension. Her typically warm smile seemed forced, her movements calculated, as if trying to make herself invisible. Jake noticed how she kept glancing at the corner booth, where a man in an expensive suit sat hunched over his phone, muttering under his breath. The diner's door chimed, and 3 young college students stumbled in, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere. They settled into a booth near the suited man, who shot them an irritated glare before returning to his angry whispers. Jake watched as Sarah's shoulders tensed before approaching their table. "Welcome to Waffle House, what can I get y'all started with?" Her voice carried a slight tremor that most wouldn't notice, but Jake hadn't survived nearly 3 decades on America's highways without developing a sixth sense for trouble. The suit's phone conversation grew louder, something about a failed business deal and someone who would pay for this catastrophe. Through the steam rising from his coffee, Jake observed as Sarah navigated between tables with the precision of someone trying to avoid a minefield. The suited man's coffee cup had been empty for 20 minutes, but she seemed reluctant to offer a refill. When she finally approached his table, the man's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with enough force to make her wince. "This coffee's cold," he snarled, loud enough for his voice to echo across the quiet diner. "What kind of incompetent establishment are you running here?" The college students fell silent, their young faces uncertain and uncomfortable. Jake's calloused fingers tightened around his mug. He'd seen this type before, wealthy, entitled, looking to take out their frustrations on someone they deemed beneath them. The trucking life had taught him when to mind his own business and when to stand up. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like an overloaded trailer on a steep grade. The suited man released Sarah's wrist, but his voice grew louder, more demanding. "I've been sitting here for an hour, watching you shuffle around like a brain-dead zombie. Do you even know how to do your job?" Sarah's face flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and fear that made Jake's jaw clench. Through the diner's windows, Jake could see the occasional headlights of passing cars on Interstate 85, each one representing someone who might stop in, might change the dynamics of this situation. But experience had taught him that waiting for someone else to solve a problem usually meant it never got solved at all. The cook, a young man named Marcus, poked his head through the service window, concern evident on his face. Jake caught his eye, and a silent understanding passed between them. Marcus had a family to support, he couldn't risk losing his job by confronting a customer. The college students were now gathering their things, clearly eager to escape the growing tension. Jake's mind drifted to his own daughter, working her way through nursing school by pulling similar overnight shifts at a diner in Tennessee. The thought of someone treating her this way made his blood boil. He'd spent his life on the roads, watching the country scroll past his windshield, seeing both the best and worst of humanity at truck stops and diners just like this one. The suited man's voice rose again, this time accompanied by the sharp crack of his hand slapping the table. "Are you deaf as well as stupid? I said I want to speak to your manager." Sarah's hands were shaking now, her notepad trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. 27 years on the road had taught Jake many things: how to navigate treacherous mountain passes, how to keep his cool in 12-lane city traffic, and most importantly, how to recognize the moments that define a person's character. As he watched Sarah retreat behind the counter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, he knew this was one of those moments. The wall clock ticked past 3 a.m., its steady rhythm matching Jake's heartbeat as he considered his options. He'd seen too many people look away, too many times when someone should have spoken up but didn't. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like an overloaded trailer on a steep grade. In the reflection of the window, Jake could see his own weathered face, lined with the stories of countless miles and countless nights just like this one. The suited man's voice had become background noise, a persistent drone of entitlement and anger that seemed to fill every corner of the small diner. But it was the silence of everyone else, the college students hurrying out the door, Marcus disappearing back into the kitchen, Sarah trying to make herself invisible behind the counter, that truly thundered in Jake's ears. His coffee had grown cold, much like the pit forming in his stomach. The next few moments would determine whether this was just another story to tell at the truck stop, or something more, something that might actually make a difference in someone's life. Jake Miller had never considered himself a hero, he was just a man who'd seen enough of life to know when something wasn't right. The suited man's phone rang again, and his voice crescendoed into a new tirade, this time directing his fury at both the caller and Sarah simultaneously. Jake's fingers drummed against his coffee cup, a habit he'd developed during long nights on the road. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to divide the diner into distinct territories, safety and danger, right and wrong, action and inaction. As the situation teetered on the edge of something worse, Jake realized that sometimes the biggest decisions in life don't announce themselves with fanfare. They creep up quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, waiting to see if someone will recognize their importance. And in this quiet Waffle House, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Georgia night, Jake Miller was about to make one of those decisions. His weathered hands pressed flat against the counter as he began to rise from his seat, the vinyl cushion creaking beneath him. The sound seemed to echo through the diner like a starting gun, marking the beginning of something that would change more lives than just his own. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most important cargo a trucker carries isn't in their trailer, but in their heart. The suited man's phone clattered against the table as Jake pushed himself up from the counter. Each step toward the corner booth felt like shifting gears on a steep mountain pass, deliberate, measured, with the weight of consequence behind every movement. The fluorescent lights cast multiple shadows of Jake's 6'4" frame across the checkered floor, like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. "I don't care about your excuses," the suited man bellowed into his phone, oblivious to Jake's approach. "Fix it, or you'll be living out of a cardboard box by morning." He ended the call with a violent jab of his finger, just as Jake's shadow fell across his table. The man looked up, his face flushed with anger and self-importance. His designer suit, probably worth more than 3 months of Sarah's salary, seemed out of place in the humble diner. His silver cufflinks caught the harsh overhead light as he gestured dismissively at Jake. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Move along." Jake remained still, his presence as immovable as a jackknifed trailer across both lanes. Years of handling volatile situations at truck stops across 48 states had taught him that silence could be more powerful than words. He simply stood there, his weathered face impassive, hands relaxed at his sides. The suited man's expression shifted from annoyance to uncertainty. People like him weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone they considered beneath them. "Are you deaf? I said this isn't your business." His voice carried a slight tremor now, the kind that appears when someone used to wielding power suddenly finds themselves unsure of their footing. Behind the counter, Sarah watched with a mixture of fear and hope. Marcus had emerged from the kitchen again, spatula in hand, ready to intervene if things turned ugly. The empty diner seemed to hold its breath, the usual comfortable sounds of the griddle and coffee maker fading into the background. Jake finally spoke, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd weathered countless storms. "You know what's interesting about driving trucks?" He pulled out the chair opposite the suited man and sat down, uninvited. "You learn to spot trouble before it happens. It's like reading the weather. You see the signs, dark clouds gathering, wind picking up, and you know it's time to either find shelter or change course." The suited man blinked, thrown off by this unexpected approach. His hand tightened around his empty coffee cup. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Right now, you're those dark clouds," Jake continued, his voice level but firm. "You've had a bad night. Maybe a bad week. Deal gone wrong, money lost, someone let you down. I get it. 27 years on the road, I've seen it all. But here's the thing about storms, they pass. What matters is the damage they leave behind." The man's face reddened further, but something in Jake's steady gaze made him hesitate. "You don't know anything about me or my situation." "You're right, I don't," Jake agreed, leaning forward slightly. "But I know Sarah over there has 3 kids at home. The youngest is fighting leukemia. Every night she's here, serving coffee and hash browns with a smile, while her heart's breaking over hospital bills she can barely afford. Yet somehow, she still manages to treat every customer with dignity." This revelation seemed to catch the suited man off guard. His eyes flickered toward Sarah, seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Jake pressed on, his voice taking on the gravelly tone of someone who'd seen too much injustice and decided to do something about it. "Marcus back there? He's working 2 jobs to put his sister through college after their parents died in a car crash last year. Every plate he cooks, every order he fills, is one step closer to keeping that promise to his family." The diner's atmosphere had shifted. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer somehow, illuminating the humanity that existed in this simple space. The suited man's aggressive posture had begun to deflate, like a tire slowly losing air. "Life's hard enough without us making it harder for each other," Jake continued, his calloused hands folded on the table between them. "I've driven through every state in this country, seen every kind of person you can imagine. And you know what I've learned? The measure of a person isn't in how they treat their equals, it's in how they treat those they think are beneath them." The suited man's phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't grab for it. His eyes remained locked with Jake's, as if seeing his own reflection in the trucker's steady gaze and not entirely liking what he saw. "I'm not here to fight you," Jake said, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here to remind you that we all have storms in our lives. The question is, do we want to be the kind of person who spreads that darkness, or the kind who helps others find their way through it?" The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Outside, a passing truck's headlights swept across the diner's windows, briefly illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where a small but significant drama was unfolding. The suited man's hands had unclenched, his shoulders dropping from their aggressive height. Sarah approached cautiously with a fresh pot of coffee. The suited man looked up at her, then back at Jake, then down at his own hands. The next few moments would determine whether this late-night confrontation would end in chaos or transformation. And in that Waffle House, under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, something remarkable was about to happen. Something shifted in the suited man's eyes as Sarah's trembling hands poured fresh coffee into his cup. The steam rose between them like a fragile barrier, carrying the familiar aroma that had comforted countless travelers through endless nights. The man's expensive watch caught the fluorescent light as he wrapped his fingers around the warm porcelain, a gesture that seemed to ground him in the present moment. "I lost everything today," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its previous venom. 7 years building a company, and it all came crashing down because someone I trusted made a stupid mistake." His shoulders slumped, the perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking more like armor that had served its purpose and was ready to be shed. Jake nodded, his weathered face showing understanding rather than judgment. "Sometimes the heaviest cargo we carry isn't in our trailers, it's in our hearts." He gestured to Sarah, who hesitated before sliding into the booth next to him. "But spreading that weight around doesn't make it lighter. It just creates more broken people." The suited man, who finally introduced himself as Richard Thompson, stared into his coffee cup as if searching for answers in its depths. "I've been that guy, haven't I? The one everyone warns their kids about becoming." His laugh was hollow, echoing against the diner's windows where the first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the Georgia night. Sarah's voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady. "My son Tommy, the one with leukemia? He has this saying the nurses taught him. Bad days are just good days taking a nap." She smiled slightly, her exhaustion evident but her spirit unbroken. "Sometimes we all need a reminder to wake up from those bad days." The diner's door chimed as Marcus emerged from the kitchen, carrying a plate he hadn't been asked to make. He set it down in front of Richard, a perfectly crafted waffle topped with fresh strawberries and whipped cream. "My sister always says you can't fix problems on an empty stomach," he offered, his natural kindness showing through despite the tension of the past hour. Richard stared at the plate, then at the people gathered around his table. The absurdity of the situation, a trucker, a waitress, and a cook trying to comfort a failed CEO in a Waffle House at 3 a.m., seemed to hit him all at once. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him, genuine this time, and surprisingly infectious. Jake watched as the laughter worked its magic, dissolving the remaining tension like morning mist. He'd seen it countless times in his years on the road, how the simple act of sharing food and conversation could bridge the widest gaps between people. The diner's harsh lighting seemed to soften, casting a warm glow over this impromptu gathering of souls. "You know what the hardest part of trucking is?" Jake asked, accepting a fresh cup of coffee from Sarah. "It's not the long hours or the lonely nights. It's watching your life through a windshield, seeing all these stories playing out in diners and truck stops across the country, and knowing you can't stop for all of them. But sometimes, just sometimes, you have to park the rig and step into someone else's story." Richard cut into his waffle, the simple action carrying a weight of humility that his expensive suit couldn't hide. "I had this whole image of success in my head," he admitted between bites. "Corner office, expensive cars, people jumping when I snapped my fingers. Funny how it takes losing everything to see how empty all that was." Marcus leaned against the booth, his spatula forgotten in his apron pocket. "My sister's studying psychology. She always talks about this thing called perspective taking, trying to see the world through someone else's eyes. Says it's the key to empathy." "Empathy," Richard repeated, as if tasting the word along with his waffle. Not exactly a popular concept in corporate boardrooms. The conversation flowed as naturally as coffee into empty cups, each person contributing their own perspective to this unexpected moment of connection. Outside, the pre-dawn traffic on Interstate 85 had begun to pick up, each passing truck's headlights sweeping across the diner like spotlight beams, illuminating this small stage where a profound transformation was taking place. Sarah shared stories about Tommy's courage through his treatments, Marcus spoke of his sister's determination to break their family's cycle of poverty through education, and Jake added tales from his decades on the road, each narrative a thread in the tapestry of human experience they were weaving together. As the night's darkness began to yield to the first hints of sunrise, Richard pulled out his phone, not to make angry calls this time, but to do something that would change multiple lives. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, his face set in an expression of determined purpose. "I may have lost my company," he said, looking up at the group gathered around his table, "but I still have resources, connections. Maybe it's time to invest in something more meaningful than market shares." He turned to Sarah, his eyes clear and focused. "How much are Tommy's medical bills?" The question hung in the air like the last star before dawn, a moment of possibility that none of them had seen coming when this night began. Jake Miller, veteran of countless roads and witness to innumerable human dramas, felt something settle in his chest, the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, the most important turns in life's journey aren't marked on any map. Dawn painted the Waffle House parking lot in shades of gold as Richard finished typing on his phone. The numbers he'd just transferred would cover not only Tommy's medical bills but a trust for his ongoing care. Sarah's hands shook as she stared at the confirmation message, tears streaming down her face. But this was just the beginning of something much larger than anyone in that diner could have imagined. One of the college students who had hurried out earlier had left their phone propped against the window, recording the entire confrontation and its unexpected resolution. By sunrise, the video was already spreading across social media like wildfire. "Trucker's Compassion Transforms Angry CEO" became the headline that would capture millions of hearts over the next 24 hours. Jake had no idea about any of this as he climbed back into his rig that morning, ready to continue his route to Memphis. But as he pulled onto I-85, his flip phone started buzzing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. By the time he reached his delivery point, the video had gone viral, and local news stations were scrambling to identify the Guardian trucker who had turned a potential confrontation into a moment of profound human connection. Richard Thompson's transformation became the talk of Atlanta's business community. The man who had lost everything found himself flooded with interview requests, not about his failed company, but about the night that changed his perspective on success. In each interview, he spoke about how a trucker's wisdom and a waitress's resilience had shown him what real wealth looked like. The story took an unexpected turn when one of Richard's former business rivals, watching the viral video in his Manhattan office, recognized the man he'd been competing against for years. James Chen, CEO of a major tech corporation, was so moved by the transformation he witnessed that he reached out to Richard with an unusual proposition. "I saw a different side of you in that video," James told Richard during their first meeting. "The kind of leadership we really need isn't about crushing competition, it's about lifting people up." Their conversation led to the formation of the Night Shift Alliance, a foundation dedicated to supporting service workers and their families through medical emergencies and educational needs. Meanwhile, Sarah's story resonated with people across the country. Other parents of children fighting serious illnesses began reaching out, forming an informal support network that would eventually become Waffle House Warriors, a community of service industry workers helping each other through difficult times. Tommy's treatment updates became a source of hope for countless families facing similar battles. Marcus, inspired by the events of that night, started documenting stories of kindness and transformation he witnessed during his shifts. His social media account, Griddle Grace, gained followers who came to the diner not just for food, but to share their own stories of unexpected compassion and connection. The original Waffle House location became something of a pilgrimage site for people seeking to recreate the magic of that night. Customers began leaving notes of encouragement for the staff, often accompanied by generous tips and offers of help for those in need. The restaurant's walls slowly filled with photographs and letters, each telling a story of lives touched by the ripple effect of one trucker's decision to step in. Local businesses started adopting what they called the Miller Protocol, named after Jake, though he'd never asked for such recognition. It was a simple approach to handling difficult situations: meet anger with understanding, replace judgment with curiosity, and look for the human story behind every conflict. The video's comments section became a forum for people sharing their own experiences of transformation. Former CEOs admitted to having been that angry person and described how the video had made them reevaluate their behavior. Service workers shared stories of customers who had come in ready to fight but left as friends after someone took the time to listen. Jake remained largely unaware of his growing fame as he continued his routes, his flip phone still his only connection to the digital world that was celebrating him as a folk hero. He only learned about the video's impact when he stopped at another Waffle House 2 states over, and the staff treated him like a returning champion. But the most profound changes were happening in the quiet moments that didn't make it to social media. Richard started spending his Sunday mornings at the Waffle House, not in a suit anymore, but in casual clothes, listening to the stories of people he would have previously ignored. He kept his promise about Tommy's medical care, but went further, working with medical billing advocates to help other families navigate the complex healthcare system. The local trucking community embraced their newfound role as guardians of the night shift. Other drivers began making regular stops at the diner, not just for coffee and hash browns, but to ensure that the spirit of that transformative night lived on. They called themselves Miller's Militia, though Jake would have cringed at the name if he'd known about it. Sarah's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. Beyond the financial relief of Tommy's medical bills being covered, she found herself becoming an advocate for service workers' rights. Her quiet strength and unwavering kindness, which had helped defuse the situation that night, became an inspiration for others facing similar challenges. As autumn approached, the story might have faded from social media's collective memory, but its impact continued to grow in meaningful ways. The Night Shift Alliance had expanded to support service workers in 20 states. Tommy's treatment was showing promising results. And in truck stops across the country, drivers shared the legend of the night when compassion proved stronger than anger. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the Waffle House parking lot as Jake Miller pulled his rig into what had become his regular spot. 3 months had passed since that transformative night, but the changes it sparked were still unfolding in ways that continued to surprise everyone involved. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was the first meeting of what the media had dubbed the Midnight Council. Inside, the diner had been transformed. The usual late-night crowd was replaced by an unlikely gathering: truckers in well-worn caps, corporate executives in casual wear, service workers from various establishments, and community leaders who'd recognized the power of what was happening here. At the center of it all sat Richard Thompson, not in his designer suit but in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking more comfortable than he ever had in his CEO days. The Night Shift Alliance has identified 347 families in need of medical bill assistance, Richard was saying, his laptop displaying spreadsheets that track the foundation's progress. But it's not just about throwing money at problems anymore. We're creating a support system that goes beyond financial aid. Sarah, now the Alliance's outreach coordinator while still keeping her Waffle House shifts, stood at the whiteboard she'd convinced the manager to install. Her map of connection points between truck stops, diners, and medical facilities across the Southeast resembled a constellation of hope. Tommy, in remission and sporting a Guardian Truckers cap, sat nearby, helping Marcus distribute coffee to the attendees. Last week, we had our first success with the Emergency Response Network, Sarah explained, pointing to a spot on the map. A trucker in Tennessee recognized the signs of human trafficking at a rest stop, just like in the training program Jake helped develop. Because of our new communication system, local authorities were able to respond within minutes. The program she referred to had grown from Jake's simple observation that truckers were the eyes and ears of America's highways after dark. What started as informal watchfulness had evolved into a coordinated network of professionals looking out for those who might need help during the vulnerable overnight hours. Marcus, who'd recently been promoted to regional training coordinator for the Waffle House chain, shared his own update. The de-escalation techniques we've implemented have reduced incident reports by 78% across participating locations. Turns out, most people just need someone to listen and understand, just like Jake showed us that night. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of James Chen, who'd flown in from New York specifically for this meeting. His tech company had developed a secure communication app for the Alliance, allowing members to coordinate responses to everything from medical emergencies to stranded travelers. The app's user base has grown to over 50,000 in just 2 months, James reported, sitting down next to Richard. But more importantly, we're seeing real behavioral changes. The Ask First feature, where people can request assistance before situations escalate, is averaging 200 uses per night nationwide. Jake, who'd been quietly observing from his usual spot at the counter, finally spoke up. "It's not about the numbers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through millions of miles on the road. "It's about changing how people see each other. Every person who walks through those doors has a story, carries burdens we can't see. Our job isn't to fix everything, it's to make sure nobody has to face their storms alone." The meeting continued as the night deepened, with representatives from hospitals, social services, and even law enforcement contributing their perspectives on how to expand and improve the initiative. The Midnight Council, as informal as it was influential, had become a model for community-driven change that was attracting attention from cities across the country. A young waitress from a truck stop in Oklahoma shared how she'd used the Alliance's resources to help a regular customer who'd been living in his car after losing his job. A corporate executive admitted how the program had changed his perspective on service workers, leading him to implement major policy changes at his company. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of transformation that had begun in this very diner. Richard, who had once measured success in profit margins and market share, now found himself leading a different kind of revolution. "We're not just changing policies or procedures," he explained, his eyes bright with purpose. "We're changing the narrative about what's possible when people choose connection over conflict." The movement had begun attracting academic attention as well. A sociology professor from Georgia State University sat in the corner, taking notes for a paper on spontaneous community organization and social change. She'd been tracking the ripple effects of that original viral video, documenting how a single act of intervention had sparked a nationwide conversation about compassion, dignity, and the power of human connection. As midnight approached, Jake shared some news of his own. Trucking companies across the country had started implementing what they called Miller Time, designated rest stops where drivers could connect with local support networks and community resources. The idea was simple: transform every truck stop and diner into a potential haven for those in need of assistance or understanding. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from another Waffle House in Texas, where a similar scene was unfolding. The movement was spreading, taking on local flavors while maintaining its core principle, that the darkest hours of the night didn't have to be faced alone. Tommy, who'd become something of a mascot for the movement, was already drawing up plans for a youth component of the program. Outside, the parking lot had filled with trucks, their drivers having detoured from their routes to be part of this gathering. Each vehicle represented a mobile outpost of the growing network, carrying not just cargo but the potential for transformation across America's highways. The night shift was no longer just about serving coffee and making deliveries, it had become about serving humanity itself. 6 months to the day after that fateful night, Jake Miller's truck rolled into the Millbrook Waffle House parking lot under a crisp winter sky. The diner looked different now, a subtle golden glow emanated from new windows specially designed to be visible from the highway, marking it as a safe haven location in the now nationwide Guardian Truckers network. But it wasn't just the exterior that had changed. Inside, the original viral video played silently on a small screen mounted in the corner, part of a rotating display showing success stories from across the country. The booth where Richard Thompson had sat during his darkest moment now bore a small brass plaque, "Where Storms Turn to Stories." It had become something of a tradition for visitors to leave notes there, sharing their own tales of transformation. Tonight was special, the official launch of the Nighthawk Initiative, a comprehensive program that would incorporate all the spontaneous movements that had sprung up in the wake of that viral video. The diner was packed, but not with its usual late-night crowd. State governors mingled with truck drivers, corporate leaders chatted with waitresses, and medical professionals shared coffee with community organizers. Tommy, now cancer-free and sporting a Junior Guardian badge, worked the room like a seasoned diplomat. His story had become a symbol of hope, but more importantly, his perspective had shaped many of the initiative's youth outreach programs. "Mom always says that bad days are just good days taking a nap," he reminded a group of business executives. "But sometimes they need help waking up." Sarah, still in her Waffle House uniform but now wearing a director's badge for the Night Shift Alliance, stood at the podium they'd set up near the counter. "6 months ago, I was just trying to make it through another night shift," she began, her voice steady with newfound confidence. "Now, we're launching a program that will transform night shifts across America into opportunities for connection and support." The program she outlined was ambitious, a network of safe havens at truck stops and diners across the country, staffed by trained volunteers and supported by a coalition of businesses, healthcare providers, and community organizations. Every location would be equipped with resources to handle everything from medical emergencies to mental health crises, all coordinated through the app James Chen's team had developed. Richard Thompson, who had traded his corporate empire for something far more meaningful, presented the financial framework. The Night Shift Alliance had grown into a multi-million-dollar foundation, but its true wealth lay in its network of volunteers and supporters. "We've created something money can't buy," he explained. "We've created community." Marcus, now overseeing training programs for service workers across the Southeast, demonstrated the de-escalation techniques that had become standard practice in participating establishments. "It's not just about preventing conflicts," he explained. "It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through these doors." The initiative had already produced remarkable results. Crime rates around participating locations had dropped significantly. Emergency response times had improved thanks to the coordinated network of truckers and night shift workers. But the most significant changes were harder to quantify: the countless moments of connection, understanding, and transformation that happened every night across the country. Jake listened to the speeches from his usual spot at the counter, still uncomfortable with being called a hero. To him, he'd simply done what any decent person should do. But as he watched the diverse crowd gathered in the diner, he understood that sometimes the smallest actions could spark the biggest changes. A group of international observers sat in one corner, taking notes on how to implement similar programs in their own countries. The model was simple but powerful: combine the natural surveillance of truck drivers and night shift workers with resources, training, and support networks to create safe spaces for anyone in need. The evening's highlight came when Tommy unveiled the new Guardian Truckers mobile app. Developed with input from drivers across the country, it would help coordinate responses to everything from medical emergencies to stranded travelers. Because sometimes, Tommy explained with wisdom beyond his years, the real destination isn't on any map. As the night deepened, the formal presentations gave way to something more organic, the kind of connections and conversations that had made the movement so powerful in the first place. A truck driver shared his experience helping a homeless veteran find housing through the network. A waitress described how the training had helped her recognize and assist a victim of domestic violence. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of transformation. Near midnight, Jake finally took the podium, though he'd been reluctant to speak. His words were few but powerful: "Life's a long haul, and none of us can drive it alone. Sometimes the most important cargo we carry is hope, and the best route we can take is the one that leads us to each other." The gathering continued into the early hours, but it wasn't just a celebration, it was a testament to the power of human connection. The Millbrook Waffle House had become more than just a diner; it was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of the night, light could be found in the simple act of reaching out to others. As dawn approached, Jake climbed back into his truck, ready to continue his route. But now, every mile he drove was part of something larger than himself. The highways had become highways of hope, and every truck stop and diner along the way had the potential to be another place where storms turned to stories.